Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works, right?
Yeah.
You give us the sources,
Yeah.
and we kind of break it all down. Really try to pull out the insights that matter,
Yeah.
the stuff that you should really be paying attention to. And today we're diving into this July 2024 GBD report.
Okay. Sounds good.
So think of this as your like fast track guide to understanding what's going on.
All right.
What, financial markets, geopolitics. We'll be looking at a lot of things. We'll be looking at these European elections, the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
Right. The anniversary.
Huge, yeah.
Yeah.
And how it all kind of fits into this like bigger historical and strategic picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to U.S. foreign policy and,
Yeah.
you know, how that kind of impacts the whole
In
world.
its reach, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this report is interesting. It's got like a little bit of everything.
Okay.
Historical analysis, economic predictions, and some pretty strong opinions too.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, always good to have a little bit of spice in there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. The report right off the bat actually highlights two pretty noteworthy events that happened in early June.
Okay.
First, you had the European Parliament elections,
Mm-hmm.
and those showed a pretty clear move to the right.
Yeah, it's
You had
yeah.
the far right gaining ground in France.
Yeah.
And then in Germany, Chancellor Scholz, he saw some pretty significant losses.
Yeah.
And then the second event, of course, the big one, was the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
Right.
So those two things kind of act like a launching point for the wider analysis in the report.
Okay, let's start with those European elections then.
Yeah.
And the report's pretty upfront about it.
Yeah.
It says that, the author sees this move to the right as, quote, a step in the right direction,
Interesting.
close quote.
Okay.
And they seem to think that left-wing and green parties have been bad for the European economies.
Yeah, I can see that argument.
They particularly point to Germany as an example.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting for our listeners, those folks interested in finance. The report then goes on to talk about what they call the deranged investment community.
That's a pretty strong word there. Deranged.
It is. Yeah, that's their word, not mine.
Okay.
And they're talking about their reaction to the election results.
So how did they react?
It sounds like they were not happy. They started selling off stocks in the euro.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the report really focuses on this contrast.
Okay.
You've got the more like traditional financial world freaking out over the right-wing shift.
Yeah.
But then the author points to stock markets in Italy and Argentina.
Oh, okay. Interesting examples.
Yeah, since they elected right-wing governments.
Okay.
So specifically, they say that the Italian stock market's up 10% so far this year
Wow.
in U.S. dollar terms.
Okay.
And then in Argentina, the Merval index is up even more,
Okay.
47% year-to-date in U.S. dollar terms.
That's pretty significant.
It is. And they even mentioned Banco Macro, which is a company we've talked about before.
Yeah, I remember them.
Up 165% over the last year.
Huge.
Huge, yeah.
What can-
100% since the start of this year.
Really paints a very different picture.
Right. So the author's basically saying, like, look beyond the headlines.
Yeah.
Look at these examples.
The data. Yep.
Because it suggests that right-wing governments are, quote, usually favorable for asset prices, close quote.
Interesting. Okay.
And they even go so far as to say that the negative media coverage is just coming from, quote, the European left-wing media and the moneyed salon socialists, close quote.
Well, that's a bold statement.
It is.
Okay.
So what does any of this tell you as someone who looks at global markets?
Well, it makes you think, doesn't it? Like, do immediate market reactions always reflect what's actually going on?
Mm-hmm.
Or are they driven by, just sentiment and bias
Yeah.
rather than actual fundamental shifts?
Right.
And if we take that idea a bit further, the report argues that maybe we give too much importance to individual political leaders when it comes to how markets perform.
Okay.
They use the U.S. stock market since 1999 as an example,
Okay.
pointing out its strong performance despite what they call, quote, poor quality presidents.
Okay.
So the argument goes that maybe less effective leaders are actually good for stocks.
That's a counterintuitive idea.
It is.
How so?
Because they're more likely to do things like print money and run up big government deficits,
I see.
which can actually boost stock prices.
Okay.
So in a way, the report suggests that a certain level of government inefficiency, at least financially speaking, could actually end up fueling market growth.
Interesting.
And if you take an even longer-term view, the report also suggests that stocks generally tend to go up over time.
Yeah.
Despite all kinds of global crises, wars, economic downturns, inflation, you name it.
Right.
The big exceptions, they say, are Marxism and communism.
So essentially, only these like fundamental systemic changes can really derail market growth over the very long term.
Yeah, that seems to be their point. What this suggests for you, the investor, is that markets have a certain degree of resilience built in.
Okay.
They can weather a lot of short-term political storms.
Now let's move on to this second big event the report highlights,
Okay.
the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings.
Right.
And the report includes this essay by Sherja Trifkovic in Chronicles
Mm-hmm.
called D-Day at 80, The Score. And right away, Trifkovic challenges the idea that D-Day was the turning point of World War II.
Interesting. Yeah, that's pretty different from how a lot of people, especially in the West, view it.
It is. What's his reasoning?
Well, he offers a different perspective on the war's most important moments.
Okay.
He argues that Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, in June of 1941, was actually a much more decisive turning point.
Okay.
And he also suggests that maybe the stalling of the German advance on Moscow and Hitler's declaration of war against the U.S. in December of 41, maybe those were even more critical
Okay.
in deciding how the war would ultimately end.
So he's essentially saying that by the end of 1941, the writing was on the wall for Germany.
Exactly.
The following years were really just about when and how that defeat would actually happen.
Yeah.
He does acknowledge that for many people, even for some historians, the Battle of Stalingrad is often seen as that major turning point.
Oh, absolutely. Stalingrad was massive.
Right.
The report goes into some detail about it, mentioning Operation Uranus, where the Soviet Red Army basically encircled and destroyed the entire German Sixth Army and a Panzer Army.
Wow.
They quote historians like David Glantz and Sir Max Hastings, who emphasized just how crucial Stalingrad was. The German and Axis forces suffered over 1 million casualties.
That's incredible.
To really get a sense of the scale, the report points out that more Soviet soldiers died defending Stalingrad than all the Americans who died in the entire Second World War.
That's a staggering statistic.
It really is. Just horrific losses on both sides.
It really highlights the sheer brutality of the Eastern Front.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Trifkovic goes on to argue that even those catastrophic losses at Stalingrad weren't the final blow for Germany.
Right.
Instead, he points to Operation Bagration, the Red Army's massive offensive in the summer of 1944, as the campaign that truly broke the Wehrmacht's back.
What was so significant about Bagration?
Well, the report emphasizes its sheer size. They say it involved something like 3.5 million men, with about 7,000 tanks and 9,000 aircraft.
Wow.
The result was the complete destruction of 28 out of 34 divisions that made up German Army Group Center. By August of 44, the Red Army was all the way to the Vistula River, basically within striking distance of Warsaw and Berlin.
Wow.
And Trifkovic argues that Operation Bagration actually destroyed more German soldiers and weaponry than the entire Allied campaign in the West combined.
That's incredible.
So essentially his conclusion is that the true significance of Overlords, of D-Day, wasn't about defeating Germany militarily, but about preventing the Soviet Union from taking over all of Western Europe. He calls it, quote, the first and arguably the most decisive operation of the Cold War, close quote.
It's definitely a different way of looking at D-Day.
It is.
Yeah.
And the report acknowledges that perspectives on D-Day do vary quite a bit, depending on national viewpoints.
Oh, yeah, of course.
For the Anglo-Saxon nations, it's this vital, ultimately successful military action.
Right.
For Russian historians, it's just one battle among many on the much larger Eastern Front.
Yeah.
And even within France, there have been different interpretations over the years.
Mm-hmm.
The report actually mentions some historical controversies around D-Day.
Mm-hmm.
For example, President Charles de Gaulle's absence from the 20th anniversary celebrations.
Right.
Apparently, he felt excluded from the initial invasion planning by the Allies.
Oh, really? Why was that?
It seems like they were initially more open to working with the Vichy government.
Oh, wow.
And there's this reader comment from Florian Tantaz, includes in the report.
Yeah, okay.
And he highlights the importance of D-Day for the Free French forces,
Okay.
because it allowed them to be a part of liberating Paris and for de Gaulle to secure co-belligerent status for France. He points out that the Allies initially wanted to treat France basically like a defeated nation, much like Germany.
Yeah, I could see how that would cause some tension.
Definitely. And then the report gets into a much darker side of the liberation.
Okay.
It mentions these books that detail instances of crimes committed by some American GIs in liberated France.
Oh, wow. Like, what kind of crimes are we talking about?
Robbery, rape, even murder.
Oh, gosh.
They even mention a letter of protest from citizens of Le Havre,
Really?
describing what they called a regime of terror imposed by, quote, bandits in uniform.
Oh, wow. That's heavy.
It is. It's a very different picture from the usual heroic narrative of the liberation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's this guy, Derek Taylor, writing for crisismagazine.com.
Mm.
He makes a similar point. He says the American good war narrative kind of overshadows the huge contribution of the Red Army in defeating the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
And he also brings up the horrible acts committed by the Western Allies.
Like what kinds of things?
The firebombing of civilian areas, the internment of Japanese Americans.
Right.
You know, these uncomfortable truths that don't always get a lot of attention.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And the report even quotes the historian Tacitus.
Okay.
He said, quote, "In war, plunder, and slaughter are called empire, and those who create a wilderness call it peace."
That's a pretty powerful quote.
It is.
Yeah.
And then they pose this kind of chilling thought experiment for you, the listener.
Oh, okay. What's that?
Imagine you're a civilian in a European village during World War II.
Okay.
Your village is about to be overrun by one of the armies, the Red Army, the Wehrmacht, or the U.S. Army. Which would you fear the least?
That's a tough question to consider.
It is.
Mm.
And the report mentions the allegations of widespread rapes committed by the Russian army during Operation Bagration.
Oh, wow.
It really highlights the brutal reality faced by civilians in wartime, no matter who's coming in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the author makes it clear that the point of this whole discussion about D-Day isn't to diminish the Allied effort, but to provide a more nuanced understanding of its historical significance.
Okay, I see.
And they have two key takeaways. First, that D-Day's primary strategic importance was probably preventing Soviet expansion, not actually defeating Germany.
Okay.
And second, it's a reminder that all wars are inherently horrific.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they quote General William Tecumseh, "Sherman War is Hell," and George Orwell. He talks about how war propaganda often comes from people far away from the fighting.
Right.
So it's a pretty sobering reflection on war and its consequences. And that leads us into the next big section of the report.
All right, what's next?
This essay by Patrick McKim titled "The Stampede of Folly: How America's War and Economic Strategies Continue to Weaken and Isolate It."
Okay.
And McKim starts by pointing out this disconnect between how economists think and how people involved in military and foreign policy think.
Okay, interesting. What's the core of his argument?
Wade draws on Barbara Tuchman's book, The March of Folly. And he says that the U.S. is basically exhibiting misgovernment across 4 different categories simultaneously.
Okay, what are those?
Tyranny, excessive ambition, incompetence or decadence, and folly or perversity.
That's quite a list. Can you unpack those a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So tyranny in this context means like oppressive or unjust rule.
Okay.
Excessive ambition is kind of self-explanatory.
Right.
Incompetence and decadence refers to the idea of like decline or decay within the government.
Okay.
And folly or perversity, that's where policies are pursued, even though there's clear evidence that they're counterproductive.
Okay.
And he points to the U.S. wars and interventions since Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and now Ukraine
Yeah.
as examples of this pattern.
So he's saying these interventions ultimately haven't achieved what they set out to do.
Right. He argues that they've actually weakened America's position in the world.
Okay.
He even brings up George Kennan's warning about the American military-industrial complex needing an enemy. So he's suggesting that this pursuit of foreign enemies might be a self-perpetuating cycle,
Interesting.
driven by the needs of the military establishment, not necessarily genuine threats.
I see.
And he's pretty critical of an article by Niall Ferguson,
Okay.
who argues for a more aggressive stance against Russia and other potential adversaries.
What does McKim disagree with?
Well, he says Ferguson is relying on these, like, outdated slogans that don't apply to the current geopolitical situation.
Okay.
He argues that the current U.S. foreign policy is actually pushing China, Russia, and Iran closer together.
Into this anti-U.S. bloc, essentially.
Exactly. He even suggests that we could see simultaneous conflicts erupt on multiple fronts because of this approach.
Wow, that's a pretty scary thought.
It is. And he also criticizes Ferguson for not really addressing the suppression of freedoms within Ukraine.
Okay.
So basically, McKim is saying that Ferguson's view of the world is stuck in the Cold War.
Okay.
He's not taking into account the economic power of China and the increasingly interconnected nature of the global system.
Right.
He even brings up Ferguson's own, quote, law, close quote, which says that empires decline when their debt interest exceeds their defense spending,
Okay.
suggesting that the U.S. is on an unsustainable path.
Interesting.
McKim also dismisses the commentary of other Bloomberg columnists,
Okay.
like Martin Ivins and Admiral James Stavridis.
Mm-hmm.
He especially dislikes Stavridis's idea of a conflict confined to a, quote, NATO lake.
Okay.
He sees this as dangerous and out of touch with the realities of modern warfare.
I see.
And he doesn't have a very high opinion of Stavridis's track record in previous military engagements.
Okay.
But a crucial point McKim makes is the difference between Russia's war in Ukraine, which he calls a war of necessity,
Okay.
and the U.S.'s limited, quote, wars of choice since Korea.
So he's saying Russia's fighting for its survival in a way that the U.S. isn't in these other conflicts.
Exactly. And he says that all of those U.S. wars of choice have been utter failures.
Wow.
He also points out that the idea of bringing back the draft in the U.S. or NATO countries is a complete non-starter.
Yeah, I could see that.
McKim then offers an interesting perspective on Putin's popularity in Russia.
Okay.
He says it's not just propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
He credits Putin with reducing corruption, improving the economy, and promoting what he calls healthy conservatism and traditional values,
Okay.
which resonates with a lot of Russians.
Interesting.
He even includes a quote from Putin about missing the Soviet Union in a nostalgic way, but not wanting to bring it back.
Okay.
So he's saying that Putin's aims are more complex than simply restoring the old empire.
Right.
McKim suggests that Putin initially tried to work with the West,
Mm-hmm.
but gradually shifted toward a more uniquely Russian path,
Okay.
particularly after seeing what he and many Russians saw as Western decadence and disregard for traditional values.
I see.
And the report summarizes some of Putin's remarks from the 2021 Valdai Discussion Club meeting,
Okay.
where he criticizes what he calls Western, quote, neo-Bolshevism,
Okay.
citing things like critical race theory and attacks on traditional family structures and religion.
Ow.
He even specifically comments on the trans phenomena.
Wow. So it's like a fundamental cultural clash.
It is. McKim argues that Russia only really acts aggressively when it feels threatened by NATO expansion.
Mm.
He points to the 2008 Bucharest summit decision to eventually allow Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO.
Right.
And he mentions Ambassador William Burns' warning at the time about how strongly Russia would react.
Okay.
She says Russia's invasion of Georgia is a perfect example of this.
Okay.
And he suggests that a similar outcome might have been avoided in Ukraine if they had stayed neutral.
Okay.
So the report then goes on to talk about Russia's long-standing strategy of, quote, defense in depth,
Mm-hmm.
and their deep-seated aversion to having hostile forces on their borders.
Right.
They draw parallels to Napoleon's and Hitler's failed invasions,
Yeah.
and even bring up the Cuban Missile Crisis
Oh, wow. Okay.
to highlight how even the U.S. reacts strongly to perceived threats in its own backyard. The report also mentions Professor John Mersheimer's predictions about Russia's reaction to NATO expansion in Ukraine,
Okay.
which turned out to be pretty accurate.
Yeah.
And it notes the U.S. involvement in Ukrainian elections and the 2014 coup,
Mm-hmm.
referencing Victoria Nuland and Senator McCain's role.
Okay.
There's even a quote from the French historian Emmanuel Todd, who calls the U.S. a predator in its foreign policy.
Wow.
McKim then highlights what he calls a recurring mistake in U.S. foreign policy.
Okay. What is it?
He uses Barbara Tuchman's concept of a, quote, law of vital interest.
Okay.
He compares the U.S. reaction during the Cuban Missile Crisis to its involvement in Vietnam,
Okay.
saying that the stakes were much higher in Cuba.
Right.
And he brings in Karl von Clausewitz's concept of will in warfare.
Okay.
The report includes a quote from Admiral Jim Stockdale, who says that will is crucial to winning any conflict.
Okay.
And McKim argues that Russia has more will in Ukraine than the U.S. and NATO do.
Because they see it as an existential threat.
Exactly. He also talks about the limitations of these wars of choice.
Okay.
He says there's a lack of really gutsy commanders who are willing to challenge bad strategies.
Okay.
He talks about corruption in the countries where the U.S. intervenes
Mm-hmm.
and the difficult geography of the conflict zones.
Like Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq.
Exactly. Places where the terrain and the local populations make it hard for the U.S. to win.
Okay.
And he details what he sees as the negative consequences of those interventions.
Okay.
Destabilized regions, the rise of extremist groups.
Right.
And he thinks the situation in Ukraine is particularly bad,
Mm-hmm.
with the potential for a long and damaging conflict.
Okay.
He's especially worried about the Biden administration's decision to let Ukraine use U.S. weapons to attack targets inside Russia.
Okay.
He thinks that could escalate things dangerously.
Yeah, I can see that would be a concern.
So to wrap up his essay, McKim goes back to George Washington's farewell address.
Okay.
He emphasizes the importance of avoiding permanent alliances and foreign entanglements
Right.
and focusing on trade instead.
Mm-hmm.
He contrasts this with what he calls the, quote, neocon way, close quote, of U.S. foreign policy,
Okay.
which is all about military intervention and global dominance.
Okay.
He reminds us that the U.S. has historically demobilized after major wars
Right.
and that the U.S. economy grew a lot during periods without a large standing army.
Okay.
He includes quotes from Winston Churchill about justice and strength,
Okay.
and Barbara Tuchman, who says that America lost some of its, quote, virtue during the Vietnam War.
Okay.
So it's a cautionary tale for current foreign policy decisions.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about. So what about the investment side of things?
Well, the report then moves on to its investment observations,
Okay.
taking into account all these geopolitical and economic factors.
Mm-hmm.
And the author starts by saying that the U.S. economy might already be in recession.
Really?
Yeah, they point to things like a decline in restaurant traffic, what they're calling the restaurant apocalypse.
The restaurant apocalypse. Wow.
Yeah, and a decrease in real disposable income for a lot of Americans.
Okay.
They also mention the recent decline in Treasury yields as a potential sign of weakness.
Okay, so what does that mean for investors?
Well, they lay out what they call a dilemma.
Okay.
On the one hand, you have persistent inflation.
Hmm.
On the other hand, you have this growing evidence of an economic slowdown,
Okay.
which could lead to bad economic data.
Right.
And that could trigger what they call a, quote, stampede into Treasury bonds.
Okay, so what would that do?
It could drive down yields on long-term bonds,
Okay.
maybe to the 3 to 3.5% range,
Okay.
which would likely push up the price of the TLT ETF.
Right, the TLT ETF tracks long-term treasury bonds, right?
Exactly. And its price tends to move in the opposite direction of interest rates.
Okay.
They also mention the LQD ETF as an alternative.
Which invests in corporate bonds.
Right, investment-grade corporate bonds.
Okay.
But the author still sees inflation accelerating in the long term,
Okay.
along with a rise in bond yields.
Okay, so how do they reconcile that with this potential stampede into treasuries?
Well, they say that if the Fed cuts rates to address any short-term weakness, it could actually make inflation worse down the road.
Right, by pumping more money into the system?
Exactly. And they also point out the huge amount of money sitting in money market funds right now.
Okay.
That could easily flow into longer-dated treasuries
Right.
if people get worried about the economy.
I see.
They also talk about the influence of the wealthy on economic policy.
Okay.
They point out that the top 10% of households own about 90% of all U.S. stocks.
Wow.
So their argument is that if the stock market takes a hit, these wealthy folks might pressure the Fed to cut rates to protect their assets.
I see. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy
Exactly. And it highlights this divide in the economy.
between the wealthy and everyone else?
Right. The wealthy are doing great while a lot of people are struggling.
Yeah.
They even quote a Wall Street Journal article that shows how the recent rise in investment income has mostly benefited the wealthy. They also make an interesting observation about generational investment trends.
Okay. What's that?
They say that baby boomers tend to invest for the long term
Okay.
because they started investing later in life, and a lot of their wealth is tied up in their homes.
Right.
But Generation Z is more likely to chase quick gains in volatile assets,
Okay.
like meme stocks or AI companies.
Because they started investing earlier.
Right, maybe with some help from their parents.
Okay.
And this difference in investing styles is connected to the narrow leadership in the stock market right now.
Okay.
You know how just a handful of big tech companies are driving most of the gains?
Right. The Magnificent Seven.
Exactly. And they say Gen Z's big investments in those companies is contributing to that.
I see.
They even point out how the S&P 500 looks great on the surface,
Yeah.
but if you look at the equal weighted version, it's lagging behind.
Showing that the gains are really concentrated in just a few companies?
Right. And they even list the impressive performance figures for those Magnificent Seven stocks since January 2023.
Wow.
But they also bring up research from Michael Mauboussin,
Okay.
a market strategist who's found that the biggest companies don't always make the best long-term investments.
Okay.
So it raises questions about how long those big tech companies can keep outperforming.
Right.
And the author draws a comparison between the current situation and the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s.
Okay.
They point out some key differences in things like treasury yields, commodity prices, home prices, inflation, government debt, and geopolitical risks.
Right.
And they basically say that things are even worse now than they were back then.
Wow.
So they think we could be at a major turning point in the markets,
Okay.
potentially the end of the era of big asset price inflation.
Okay.
And they suggest that the old tricks of monetary inflation and big government spending might not work anymore.
So what are they recommending investors do?
Well, they say to increase the maturity of your bond holdings.
To lock in current yields.
Exactly. And they advise against adding to your stock positions.
Speaking of the risk of a downturn.
Right.
Okay.
And as you might expect, they still really like gold, silver, and platinum.
Oh, yeah, of course.
They cite all the economic uncertainty, the fragile financial system, the geopolitical risks,
Right.
and NATO's reluctance to de-escalate tensions.
Okay.
And the investment section ends with a quote from George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia
Okay.
about how unreliable the media can be.
Right.
They're basically urging listeners to think critically about the information they encounter,
Yeah, that's always good advice.
especially these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to wrap things up, this deep dive into the GBD report has covered a lot of ground.
It really has.
We've talked about a potential turning point in financial markets,
Yeah.
the influence of geopolitics,
Mm-hmm.
what the report sees as flaws in U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
We've looked at different perspectives on war and its consequences. And we've considered what all this means for your investments.
Definitely a lot to consider.
And the report leaves us with a sense of caution about the future.
Mm.
It challenges some of our assumptions about market stability, political leadership, even our understanding of historical events like D-Day.
Yeah, it really makes you think about things differently.
It does. So what are your final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of questioning the narratives we're given,
Mm-hmm.
especially in a world that's as complex and rapidly changing as ours is.
Right.
And I think this report really encourages you to do that, to develop your own independent critical thinking skills.
I agree.
And maybe the most important question for you to consider is how much your own views